Our next speaker, you might know already from last year. Many of you remember her, Catherine Devine, Business Strategy Leader for Libraries and Museums at Microsoft Worldwide Education. This year, she will talk about digital innovation for museums, opportunities and gaps highlighted by COVID-19 crisis. And immediately after Catherine, Prodromos will join her again in a live session and discussion. So enjoy.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for having me today. Delighted to be speaking at this event that I spoke at last year while visiting Athens and Thessaloniki. Certainly disappointed not to be here in person, as I'm sure we all are, but look forward to connecting again in the future. My name is Catherine Devine. I work for Microsoft, and I am the Global Leader for Libraries and Museums Strategy, which means that I'm responsible for thinking about what are the technology needs of libraries and museums globally, and how does that help further their missions. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about that today. But before I go there, let me start with how we think about digital transformation and the opportunities that exist for museums globally. So I developed this in my time at Microsoft, and this is a way of thinking about the digital transformation holistic picture for museums specifically. And you'll notice that it doesn't talk about specific technologies, but rather about the functions of a museum. And so very broadly, it covers the visitor experience, collections, running the building, running the museum. And I've spoken about this many times in the past, and I can certainly direct you to resources around it. But for now, we want to focus on really just two key pieces for this conversation. One is around education and community, and one is around beyond the walls. And beyond the walls meaning, how do people interact with the museum when they don't visit the museum? And certainly that's very relevant to the conversation around COVID. But before we go there, let me start with a quote. And this is a Chinese proverb that I'm sure you've heard, but it's very relevant to this conversation. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. And I think this is a very relevant quote to thinking about how we approach digital and technology in museums. So firstly, when COVID hit around the world, we saw museums closing globally. I think almost every museum in the world has closed at some point and throughout this crisis. And if they're not closed now, then they're currently operating at limited capacity. There's very few exceptions to that rule, which raises the question, which is, for the identity of a museum, what is left when the building does not exist? Because we're now 9 months into this crisis. This is not a short-term thing, and it's certainly having a major impact, not only on the sustainability of organizations, but actually on their identity. And I think this is where digital can help. But before I get there, I want to bring a quote to you that I have often used in thinking about digital strategy. And this is by an author, Ray Wang. I don't think it's actually attributed to him. However, this is the context in which I heard it. And this is this idea of disrupt or be disrupted. That is, you need to be constantly innovating your organization, or someone will come in and innovate, and you will find that you no longer have a role. And I think that that's very key for museums as they struggle to work out how to operate in the current environment, not before COVID and also after COVID. Expectations of visitors are changing throughout the world. Their life experience is changing. There are so many other opportunities for to compete against museums for attention time that we have to think about how to authentically engage and pursue our mission in the best possible way. And digital is a tool to do that in addition to the building. And so to answer that first question, the building might be closed, but it doesn't mean the museum is closed. And certainly technology has provided us a way to expand the reach of a museum that goes beyond not just the actual locality of the museum, but actually beyond a country and actually globally. And this ability to reach a global audience is really, I think, a transformational moment for museums, because no longer are you required to be in the city and available and get to a building to be able to experience a museum. But this does not in any way say that we want to eliminate the building from the museum experience. Of course we don't. It's about adding to that and it's not about taking away, and it's not an either-or conversation. It has taken a crisis such as COVID to get us to focus on digital and technology in museums. We've seen every organization look for how to conduct the work of the museum from remotely, from remote homes throughout the world. And it's not just about the employee experience of how to work remotely, it's also been how do we actually engage with our visitors, and how do we continue that engagement? And so now we're actually starting to see digital as being an enabler of the mission. It's always been that, it's just that we haven't necessarily seen it as that. But now we're increasingly seeing it as key to enabling the mission. And it's never been more obvious than when there is no building open. I think this idea of mission is really important. We've often thought about digital as being the digital team. It's over there. It's a different set of skills. It's different than the rest of the museum. And this is classic in any organization that's going through rapid changes in the market and innovation. And so this is a key takeaway here, is how do we think about digital as being equal to the building, as being an enabler of the mission. It has its own role, it's doing its own piece. And I think that inadvertently, and certainly unintentionally, by us focusing on the physical building, we've actually been limiting our ability to deliver on the mission of the museum. And let me talk a little bit more about that. So when museums leverage digital to reach their audiences, both before COVID and after, they found a number of interesting phenomena. And the one is they're actually reaching more people than they could ever reach in the physical building. By definition, there's a capacity limitation, but there are also barriers, other barriers to how many people you can reach. When you suddenly open it up to the world, you certainly have a much larger platform to spread your message. The second thing is that, of course, it actually opened access to the building, access to the museum, for people. So now more people can access the museum. If they live in a different country, they can still access the museum. If they have childcare arrangements, if they have other financial, socioeconomic or physical disabilities that don't allow them to physically visit the building, they can still have access to the museum. And you can see how this has a big impact on diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, which are big conversations right now. Which brings us to The Innovator's Dilemma by Clayton Christensen, a famous book that I'm sure you're familiar with, and a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with. But essentially, this is this idea, which is, at what point do you start to cannibalize your own successful model in order to be able to ensure that you have a sustainable future, to ensure that you are not disrupted by a disruptor? As I mentioned, technology is key to maximizing diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. And if for no other reason we look at digital as the way that allows us to do that, that is an important takeaway. But while we're reaching more people, we still can't reach everybody. And this is outside of the role of a museum, but there are still many barriers for access. It will surprise you to know that many people still do not have sufficient access to the internet, to devices, to skills, to have the confidence. And so we're still seeing 25 to 50% of the community, even in the Western world or the developed world, of people who don't have full capacity. And where this used to be a luxury, this is no longer a luxury. Now this is actually physically a barrier that is limiting their full participation in society. And so it's something that we also want to keep in mind, that because we're expanding reach and access does not necessarily mean that we've completely covered the entire population, but we've certainly made great strides. But it's not only our audiences who have challenges here, it's also museums who need to develop skills around digital. We need to think of digital as its own channel with its own set of skills, just like we think of a building and the experiences in a building as their own channel with their own skills. And to that end, we'll find that over time, the mix of skills in a museum will need to change, and we'll need to develop a core set of competencies for everybody in the museum. museums are very much on the wrong side of the digital divide, and this gap is widening each day. We're finding that both the understanding of the adoption of technology and the skills to actually use technology and understand how it could be leveraged are definitely lacking and need to rapidly increase in order to ensure that we avoid being disrupted. So as a result of COVID, we've seen a few interesting things emerge. One is people are now definitely seeing technology as an enabler of their mission. If they saw it in no other way, they saw it through remote work and the need for everyone to work remotely and how technology afforded that possibility. I think everybody in the world learned that one. Secondly, we need to rely on additional sources of revenue beyond the idea of tickets and people who are coming to our shops and physical experiences, and how technology allows us to actually look at doing that, although that is still a very much in learning process. And then, of course, we're looking for new ways to engage beyond just the in-building experience. So these are three things that we're seeing globally around the world. And as we expand those channels to include digital channels, the skill set needs are changing, as I was mentioning previously. So I think the first is it's important to separate digital literacy from digital skills. And let me explain what I mean here. What I'm saying is digital literacy is the ability to actually understand how technology can enable the mission and how it can be used. So it becomes part of the conversation at the executive table when you're thinking about what are the priorities for the museum. It's about people understanding what technology can do. It's not necessarily about them being able to do it. I think that can be a different set of skills. And then, of course, there are the skills, people who can code, people who can use technology, people who can leverage it. And there's a certain core level that everybody needs. And then there's specialist skills depending on the particular channel that we're focused on. And then, of course, there is organizational agility, which has nothing to do with skills, but has everything to do with mindset of the organization. And this is this ability to rapidly respond and adopt new ways of doing things. Now, we've all done this with COVID. We're all capable of doing this, but when we're in the absence of a crisis, we're not necessarily focused on that. And so it's good to work out how we can do this when we're not in crisis as well. So let's talk a little bit about what reimagining digital channels looks like. And I think it's important that we start with what is the experience that is the ideal experience there, that is independent of the tools available to do that. And so we did that with a building. When we did a building, we thought about what is the experience of an exhibition, not, oh, we have these tools and these tools, how do we cobble them together? And so I think sometimes with digital, we tend to look at it this way. We tend to say, oh, we've got websites and we've got events and we've got videos and we've got newsletters and we've got all these things. Let's do something in all of those channels. And that's not the right way to think about it. What we really want to think about is independently of the tools, just imagine what is possible, what would be the ideal way to engage. And we have very creative people in this industry, so we're perfectly capable of doing this. And then look at the tools that bring that together, and some are relevant, some are not relevant, depending on what we're trying to achieve. Experimentation is key here. Nobody has the answers, nobody knows what works, and even if we do know what works, it doesn't stay still for very long. This is true of every industry, and it's true in museums as well. We need to build an experimentation culture that what we used to call fail fast. I never liked that term, but this idea of understand what works, understand what people want, find the thing that you feel authentically comfortable with. And in the case of monetization, which is the big question today, which is what will people pay for? And how do you think about that? So that brings us to the big question of the day, which is how do you monetize digital in museums? And I think the jury is out on that. I don't think anyone has a clear view, but I will say that there is things to be learned from other industries who've been here before us. And I think the classic here is the newspaper industry. Newspapers started offering digital content about 20 years ago, and they offered it for free. I'll show you this quick process. history. I'm sure you're familiar, but just for the purposes of this discussion, let's look at it. They offered stuff for free, and then over time, that was great. Over time, they started losing revenue from digital. So they tried to make revenue in the, they lost revenue from physical. They tried to make revenue in digital channels, and that completely flopped. And the reason it failed for them is because they'd offered it for free, it was very hard to get people to pay for something they used to have for free. And that's an important lesson in the industry, in the internet world. And then the balance between physical and digital started to change because people had more access to devices and content and internet and all of those good things. So then they were left with reducing revenue, no ability for people to charge in digital. And that was, really challenging. Some newspapers, New York Times and some others, came up with a success. Many fell by the wayside. And now digital is a major part, or if not already, then very close to being the major part of all of their businesses. And the skill sets, the product, the business model, everything about the organization has actually changed in 20 years. It's completely different to what it looked like in the 1990s. And this is an important lesson. If it can happen in newspapers, it can happen elsewhere, it can happen here. And the question about whether or not you succeed or not in the long term is a function of your ability to be agile, to evolve, to think about this, and to start charging for digital from the beginning, and to think about things like freemium models where there is a base level of content that is available for free, that solves the issue of equity and access. And then there are people who are willing to pay. So how can you leverage them, and how can you do that at scale? Those museums have embraced digital are the most resilient and are the ones that will survive this crisis and also future, not just crises, but just generally in the future. And I think it's important to take away from here where we started, which is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but the second best time is now. So if you're not fully embracing digital now as a way to consider how to look at your organization holistically rather than, digital as a side show, then this is the time to do it, because it really is a strategic enabler of your mission. And with that, I thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all today.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello, Catherine. That was a good
Hi,
talk.
Prodromos. How are you?
Quite well, quite well. Enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
Too many interesting things, I guess, and we have only 15 minutes. But I'll try to start firing with a couple of ones which I think are the most crucial for our audience. I just come from another panel where we had a discussion about digital transformation with cultural workers and museum people, so from the digital side. And a first question also coming after your presentation is, what is infrastructure today? What is digital infrastructure today?
That's a really interesting one. I find that so many of us focus on what we call the front end looks like, what the experience looks like, which is absolutely essential. But of course, you cannot scale or do things in a cost-effective way, or even reach a global audience without the right infrastructure underneath. And just like there is a discipline around building buildings, so clearly, if you don't build it properly according to certain standards, codes, etc., you end up with a house of cards that falls down. The same thing will happen. You'll find that you're over-investing in technology. And I think that's what we're seeing a lot of right now, a lot of recreating lots of things over and over. And so it's very difficult to talk about digital platforms or talk about digital infrastructure, cloud, those kinds of things, but they're important to being able to scale. And I think a lot of the conversations we're having today is around how do we scale? How do we reach this international audience? How do we reach more people, be more accessible, all those kinds of things. So I'll just comment that I apologize about the sun. It is very sunny here in Seattle this morning, which is unusual.
If you have sun, you shouldn't apologize for sun ever.
I know, it doesn't happen very often, so we're enjoying it, yes.
So this is something that also came quite clearly from your presentation, what you said, that infrastructure, two things: we shouldn't look just to the front, We shouldn't look just at the technology. And you also mentioned during your presentation the importance of skills and the importance of having museum staff being reskilled potentially or increasing their skills. And this at the same time, it is something which we all understand. And I think the difficult question is how?
It's a difficult one, and particularly depending on sort of which generation you grew up in, it's very hard to get this idea. You know, when I was at school, you went to school, you went to university, you pursued a profession, and you may have had some continuing education elements to that, but it's nothing like what we're seeing today in 2020, where, and this is not just around skills in museums, this is just skills generally, skills for general life and skills for professions. Is this idea, and I don't know if it was you or whether it was Tom Fleming who said earlier today, I think they quoted Alvin Toffler, which is this need to learn, relearn, unlearn. I think that, I hope it was Alvin Toffler. I can't remember the citation, but this is key. This is a key piece of how we live today. Everything that we've done. When I started working, and I'm going to date myself here, but when I started working, you know, computers, I grew up in Australia and computers had only just started in Australia when I left university. So that was the mid 1980s. And we've been through everything since. We've been through the personal computing revolution, the internet revolution. We're now in dealing with spatial computing, artificial intelligence, and all the way through that technology career, I've completely had to reinvent myself. I don't know how many times now. It's not even recognizable. And I think that this is the nature of working in technology, but now that is now pervading into all the other industries. And so what we need to do is, as a society, just generally, is how can we continually get into this idea of continuing to learn, continuing to explore, be curious, open ourselves up to new ways of doing things. One of the things that I often sort of suggest is that much of our need to hold on to the past or to hold on to what we feel comfortable with is actually, that thing has only existed for a generation. So if we look back to how we all started working or school, that is a significantly different experience than our parents and our grandparents, etc. And so sometimes I find that we want to hold on to what we're comfortable with, but actually that has never been true. It's always been a state of change for hundreds of years now, not just, you know, the last 40 or the last 20. And so when it comes to skills, I think it's really this mindset of continuous education, continuously learning new skills. And I don't just mean things like, how do I use collaboration software, for example, like meeting software like we're on now. It's not just that, it's just generally, how can technology further your mission, right? How can I be aware? I talked in my speech about digital literacy and this idea of separating people who can code from people, because we always talk about technology as only being coding. How can we separate that from the idea of, I just know that technology could be a viable channel for me to achieve the mission of my museum. That in no way suggests that I can go and code or create something digital, in the same way that leaders of the museum are not necessarily the people who are the best to create exhibitions. So I think that's coming back, it's a long answer, but coming back, it's that mindset. It's like, how do we move in that? Now we're seeing this in lots of other industries. We're seeing it through the education system as well. And I think that that's the big change about how we live.
Do you think in this change, and you mentioned before how this continuous change is something which is prevalent in certain industries like technology, and now when technology is basically everywhere, it becomes something which it's becoming the status quo even in the cultural sector, which normally, as we frequently say, it's almost by definition slow, and it looks to the past. At least quite a big chunk of what we call the cultural sector, not all, but a big chunk. My question is, in this acceleration process we're in, and in this quantification of things, how is going to affect the workers or the staff of the museums in the cultural sector in terms of how they do their work? Is it going to be something which is going to make them more performance oriented, or is it something which is going to actually increase anxieties within their working space?
I don't know. I mean, I think you could take it two ways. You could take the example that I took in the newspaper industry, which is clearly the skills to run newspapers today is completely different than the skills it did in the past. You still have journalists, however. Those journalists are still trained, and then they're now dealing with new tools to, I'm not a journalist, so I don't know exactly what they do, but they're using new tools instead of old tools, right? But really they're doing the same work. But a lot of other things in the organization have changed substantially. When I talked about business models, people who are doing that kind of thing. So I think it's important to look at this as, and I think industry has been guilty of this over the years. If we use these really big terms that are inaccessible to people and which create this aura of technology is not accessible to you. You're either a technologist or you're not a technologist. And people are often apologizing for not understanding technology. And that's not a good thing. What it really needs to be is you don't need to be the person who does it. You just need to be the person who understands what is possible with it. Now, the people who do it, those skills change. They're completely different sort of skills. The people who create an exhibition, for example, are still creating exhibitions. Now, if it's in an art gallery, it's a little bit different than, say, natural history museums, where natural history museums, you're creating models and things like that. Well, now, obviously, you're creating digital models, and you're using a whole skill set around 3D, and it's a completely different set of skills, but the creativity process is the same. So I think it's not about throwing what we call the baby out with the bathwater and sort of saying it's completely different, but it's about seeing it as a new way of doing things, the same things you were doing, but new tools to use it. So instead of using this hammer, you're now using this, whatever digital tool to do it. So I think but I also accept that it's very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable for people to be changing, and particularly changing in the middle of your career, particularly if you've even if you're new to the industry or new to a career, it's just difficult to accept change. It creates stress, as we've all seen this year in 2020. It's been challenging for everybody. So I think that's, maybe that goes back to the leadership in museums to really think about, what is the stress that we're placing on people, but it's a necessary change that we're going to need to make to be able to stay relevant, to be able to access. One of the other things I sort of say from time to time is this idea that we have inadvertently made our museums inaccessible. And what I mean by that is by focusing on the building and by focusing on the physical experience, and that makes perfect sense, and there will always be and doesn't go away. By focusing on that, we are forgetting about the people who are not included, which includes people who have childcare arrangements, people who are on the other side of the world, people who have, as we've talked a lot today about this elitism that happens in museums, people who just don't feel comfortable feeling like it's not a place that they belong. So we've made it inaccessible to those, but digital allows us to transcend those. And so that's why it's important that we think about it, but also important that we know how to do it properly. And to that, we need the right skills, and it's going to be uncomfortable. It's change. It's going to be really difficult. And I think our leadership needs to think about how we're going to manage through that.
Speaking about leadership, and if we talk about skills as being the key element for this from the side of the staff, in terms of the institutions, how can they innovate? What we've seen during the pandemic is that because of the need to come to new solutions very quickly, the museums had to innovate. So this is in the same way that technology was not exactly their cup of tea. Innovation wasn't either. But both came at the same time with great force. So because they couldn't respond to the technological needs that fast, they had to find shortcuts. They had to find solutions. What would you see out of this? How would you see the innovation process being worked from an institutional side?
Yeah, I think, we've talked about this for a long time, this idea of creating this innovation culture, and how do you do that? I think the thing that we should all take away from this is that we all innovated when we had to. Right? So come March, it was amazing, the speed at which museums were able to innovate. And so what does that mean? That means that we were always capable of it, always. It wasn't because of the pandemic. The pandemic just created a crisis that required us to respond, but we were always capable. And so what can we learn from that? And how can we think about how to bring that into the culture of the organization? Now, maybe we don't want to be quite so reactive. as we were in March as a general course of being, but we can definitely think about, we don't, you know, I made this comment in my presentation, we don't actually know what works, right? We think we know what works, but until we actually do something and we see the response, we don't know what works. So we have to iterate through this. And so I talked a lot about, you know, this idea of organizational agility, this idea of being able to be an organization that really responds to and thinks about how can we experiment as just a general course of the DNA and the culture of the organization. And I think museums, rightly so, are very careful about the message that they're projecting to the world and making sure that it's completely okay. And in that process, we can be not responsive. But I think it's about finding somewhere on that spectrum between being completely perfect with the message and being completely laissez-faire, right? There's somewhere in the middle that is a comfortable place that we can gradually move along that spectrum. And I think that that experimentation culture of let's try this, let's see what works, and then scale from there is something that that we need to do. And we do this all the time at Microsoft. So you'll know that I come from the museum industry, so I've seen both industries, but I've been a technologist all my life. And now that I'm in Microsoft, I'm not saying that Microsoft is perfect by any chance, but this is the normal way of life. We try lots of things and then we find that things don't work and we iterate through them. And in fact, it is a challenge for me because on any one day, every time I open Microsoft software, it's different because we get preview versions of things, right? So that they test out on the 200,000 staff. So every day I've got like a new feature and I have to adjust and all this kind of stuff. And this is the way the world works now. And we'll have to sort of think about how to sort of bring that kind of experimentation culture into the organization.
Catherine, thank you so much.
Thank you. It was great chatting to you.
We'll keep that message. Let's try it. Let's scale it.
Yeah.
Let's make it happen. Thank you so much, Catherine. And thank you all for attending this short discussion. Thank you very much.
Yes. And thank you for the opportunity. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.